Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new session on building dynamic applications with Blazor. And today we are here with a new speaker, Shaun Walker. So I hope you all people are excited about this particular session because, we all know that you are pretty excited to watch the session of Shaun in BlazorConf Bhubaneswar, but somehow we missed him, but we got him back. So welcome, Shaun.
No, I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to share some information about Blazor. I was very disappointed with myself that I somehow missed the session at the conference that happened recently. So I'm very grateful that you invited me to share some information with your audience today.
It's always a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Thank you. And with that, should I just dive straight in?
Sure, the screen is all yours. I'll just go off screen.
All right. Yeah, so today we're going to talk a bit about building dynamic applications with Blazor. For those of you who attended the conference, so you've already seen a lot of information about the capabilities of Blazor. And one of my colleagues, Michael Washington, did a session at that conference about building modules with a new framework called Octane, which is built with using Blazor. And I'm going to talk a bit about that framework as well. So I'm Shaun Walker. I guess my claim to fame is that I was the original creator of a open source platform or framework called DotNetNuke. That was an open source project that I started way back in 2003. It was, of course, built on some legacy Microsoft technology, web forms, all those things that we loved so much in that time frame. I created a company around the open source project called DNN Corp with 3 other co-founders, and we actually raised venture capital. It was an interesting experience to go through. I was a Microsoft MVP for many years, I think for probably 12 years. I'm no longer a Microsoft MVP for like the last 5 years. I'm hoping that maybe someday I'll be a Microsoft MVP again. I'm a member of a group called the ASPInsiders. And we're going to talk today about Octane, which is a new open source project that I've created. And I also am the chair of the .NET Foundation Project Committee. And I've actually been involved with the .NET Foundation since it started in 2014. As a volunteer, I was a member of the advisory council for a number of years. And for, I guess, the last year and a half, I've been managing the project committee. And the role of the project committee is to review new project applications for open source projects that want to become part of the foundation, and also to lend a hand when issues or challenges come up with existing projects that are part of the foundation. And I find that to be quite a rewarding activity to be involved in. Obviously, the .NET Foundation has a lot of reach and a lot of impact on the .NET ecosystem. Participated in writing a lot of books over time. I've never written an entire book myself, but contributed to many books. And currently I'm employed by Cognizant. It's a division within Cognizant called SoftVision, also called Software Product Engineering now. And in that, I'm a technical director and enterprise guild lead. So I have a lot of content to share, and I'm probably going to skip through some of it or go through some of it quite quickly, because I believe that probably the folks who are tuned into this session already are familiar with Blazor, or at least some of the fundamentals of Blazor. And originally this session was supposed to kick off the conference and sort of set the stage for the other speakers. However, obviously that didn't happen, but I think that some of the background of the history of Blazor is still interesting and probably was not something that was shared by any of the other speakers at the conference. So obviously Blazor is a single page application framework for building interactive web applications with .NET Core. And I think the main thing here is that you can build a single page application in a full stack manner, right? So using C# both on the front end and the back end. That's really the main differentiator that Blazor brings to the table over some of the other single page application frameworks which exist today. I think we're all pretty familiar with single page applications. We've been developing them for many years now and for enterprise customers. Basically, the original single-page application architecture involved a JavaScript framework, which was running on the client, and that JavaScript framework was responsible for updating the user interface. And typically, then you would use AJAX to make calls back to the server to get data. Very much, this is a popular model because it emulates some of the characteristics of a desktop application, right? So it's a web application with the user interface characteristics of a desktop application because it feels very responsive to the end user, as opposed to if you contrasted it to some of the server-based web applications that had been built previously, where you had to wait for a full page refresh, sometimes for content to be refreshed. That didn't really have the same kind of a desktop user experience. So single page applications, I think, are here to stay because of the benefits that they provide to the end user. Where Blazor comes in is there's a flavor of Blazor that runs on WebAssembly, and that runs natively in the client. And then there's also a flavor of Blazor for Blazor Server that runs on the server, but is still able to provide that interactivity to make it feel like a single page application model. So the big question, I guess, that comes up is like, why did Microsoft, create Blazor? Why is this even a problem that needs to be solved? There's already a lot of other solutions out there in the industry that allow you to build single page applications. So I think from a business perspective, the things that comes to mind is one of the challenges that we're seeing recently is around resource shortages, right? So when people want to build a single page application using the traditional tools, they'll say, oh, I want a full stack developer. And what does that mean? Well, they want someone who's fluent with C# probably, or perhaps other technologies, but because we're talking about Microsoft technology here, it'd be C# on the back end, and it would be JavaScript of some flavor on the front end. Could be React, could be Angular, but like those types of developers that are really strong, both in the back end, C# environment and the JavaScript environment, are very rare. Like they're really hard to come by. There's a lot of traditional C# application developers that feel comfortable on the back end and not necessarily comfortable on the front end. And then there's lots of folks who came from the web side that are really strong with JavaScript, but they don't really feel comfortable writing code in C#. So that leads to this model where you end up having to split the roles. So you end up having front-end developers and back-end developers. And from a customer perspective, that means the size of the team that's required to build your applications has maybe not doubled, but it's certainly grown quite significantly. That means the cost of developing applications has gone up. And so those are some of the resource challenges that exist today because of the difference in the technologies that are being used on the front end and the back end. And then you have the technical challenges. So, I mean, the back end folks, so the back end developers and the front end developers obviously have to be in close communication about what they're developing so that they can interface with one another. But we've all had these experiences, I'm sure, where there's a misalignment of communication or a misalignment of requirements. And so the back end developers are building what they think needs to be done, and the front end is building it, and then they try to mash it together and it doesn't work, right? And you end up with a lot of inefficiencies and problems that arise because of this model, because you're trying to blend two different types of technologies and two different skill sets together. Certainly many companies and there's many projects that are doing this successfully today, but it is a constant challenge. And so I think the goal behind Blazor is that if you could use a single consistent stack of technology for both the front end and the back end, you could avoid a lot of these problems that we're seeing here. And so that is the fundamental goal behind Blazor. And I believe it does achieve that goal. So going into a little bit of the history, and I don't know, I think for those people who have just got involved in experimenting with Blazor, probably didn't realize it's been around for a while already, but the first glimpse of Blazor happened back in June of 2017. So, that's like 4 years ago. There was a conference in Oslo, one of the MDC conferences, which are, one of the very popular developer conferences that have been around for many years. And at that conference, Steve Sanderson, who is a Microsoft employee, who's obviously quite famous for his work on many different, web-based development frameworks for Microsoft. I think the most famous one is probably Knockout.js, which was one of the early like JavaScript frameworks that developers used for more intensive work on the front end. Actually, it was probably more for data transfer. But anyways, so Steve wanted to demonstrate some up-and-coming technologies. And one of the technologies that he wanted to demonstrate was how you could build applications using WebAssembly with C#. And so he came up with this proof of concept all on his own. Actually, he hadn't really shared anything about this proof of concept even with his managers. And so he did the demonstration at this NDC Oslo event and kind of blew everyone away because they couldn't believe what he was capable of achieving. So he demonstrated, a native C# application that was running in the browser on WebAssembly. So after that event, excuse me, Steve obviously had generated a lot of buzz within Microsoft, within the ASP.NET group. And so I guess they had probably some internal discussions, and then they decided that they were going to move it into the ASP.NET organization and focus more resources on it to build it out as a more robust experimental product. And so obviously there's some time frame between this, right? So from June 2017 to February of 2018, I guess there was a lot of deliberation about whether Microsoft wanted to invest in this area. And they finally announced in February of 2018 that they were going to start developing it as a more serious experimental product. And so from February 2018 to April of 2019, they shipped a lot of different versions that were all deemed to be experimental. But the community was really interested in this technology. And there was a lot of capabilities that it brought to the table that probably weren't even imagined in the early stages, like some of the adaptability of the technology, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But anyways, once we got to April of 2019, Microsoft said that it's no longer experimental. It is now an official product. So Blazor is official, and they were planning, at that point, they announced that they were going to ship it as part of .NET Core 3.0. And so if we look at the overall timeline, right, we have, June 2017, that first POC at NDC Oslo, and then 2018, experimental announcement, and then 2019, the code was actually merged into .NET Core 3.0, and it had an official preview, and at that point, it was no longer experimental. But .NET Core 3.0 shipped in September of 2019. Blazor was shipped along with it, and that, of course, only included Blazor Server. And we'll talk about the differences between Blazor Server and Blazor WebAssembly in a minute. But .NET Core 3.1 came along in December of 2019, and that was a long-term support release. So Blazor Server has long-term support already. .NET Core 3.2, which came in May of 2020, so last year, was the general availability of Blazor WebAssembly. And then .NET 5, of course, came along a bit later, November of 2020. And that it was still a GA release, and so Blazor WebAssembly is still deemed to be GA. It doesn't have long-term support on it quite yet, but coming up this November will be .NET 6, and both flavors of Blazor, both server and WebAssembly, will be deemed to be LTS at that point. So, like I said, there's the two flavors of Blazor. The interesting thing is, when you do development in Blazor, everything is based on this component model, this Razor component model, which has been introduced. And the cool thing is that you can adapt that Razor component model to host your applications in multiple ways. So you can, right now, there's obviously support for Blazor Server and Blazor WebAssembly, but there's also additional hosting models that'll be coming in the future. We're going to talk a bit about Blazor Server first because it was the original release that Microsoft made. And this is actually, where some people get a bit confused. The original proof of concept for Blazor was based on WebAssembly. That was what Steve Sanderson demonstrated, and that's what got people's attention. However, Microsoft actually shipped Blazor Server first. And there's some reasons why they did that, which we're going to talk about. Blazor Server leverages that same Razor component model that I talked about. it utilizes a server-side hosting model. So that means that the actual code that you write is running on the server, and it's communicating with the browser through SignalR, through WebSockets. So there's like a continuous communication channel that's established between the browser and the server, and that allows the application that's running on the server to still have very responsive characteristics, and make it appear to the end user like it's still a very streamlined single-page application experience. If we look at a diagram, we've got Blazor server, so the Razor components written in C# running on the server, communicating with the browser over SignalR. And just to be clear here, because this is another area of confusion sometimes, is that there still is JavaScript that's involved in this solution, right? There is a DOM differencing kind of capability that exists in the browser that's part of Blazor. And so SignalR is actually interacting with that JavaScript component, and it's doing partial page refreshes based on JavaScript under the covers. So that's part of obviously the Blazor server JS library that's transferred to the browser when you run a Blazor server application. But that's just more technical details into what's actually happening under the covers. Some of the benefits of Blazor server is, of course, it avoids the unnecessary full page refreshes. So it's a single page application model still, as opposed to a server based web application which does a full page refresh. It has faster startup time. So when a browser connects to the server, it doesn't have to download, it downloads a minimal amount of information and can start up pretty quickly. Because it's running on the server, it has full access to all of the .NET Core, and I guess what we would say is .NET 5 APIs now. Full debugging support. So this was a big one, and this is actually probably the main reason why Microsoft shipped Blazor server first. Because it's a server-based solution, all of the tooling and the development experience that you've come to expect from like Visual Studio and the Microsoft tool set was supported for Blazor server without much work. The only work that needed to be done was to do some improvements related to SignalR when it comes to connections that are dropped and need to reconnect. But for the most part, the debugging experience for Blazor server almost existed from day one. The other benefit of Blazor server is it supports legacy browsers. So browsers that don't support WebAssembly, and there's actually, if you're using modern browsers, then that's not so much of an issue. But there is, of course, environments where they use older browsers or browsers that are like less full-featured or less functional. And in those environments, Blazor server is an option that can be used. And of course, it's got official LTS support. More of the benefits, you can, as compared to writing an application using Blazor WebAssembly, Blazor server applications tend to have less code and lower complexity. And so the reason for this is because as a server-based application, it can access server resources directly. So from your Razor components, you can call a database directly. You can call the file system directly. Whereas when you're writing WebAssembly, Blazor WebAssembly applications, that's a true client-server application where you actually have a client application that needs to communicate with the server over HTTP. So that involves more code and more complexity in your application. But it also has additional benefits when it comes to scalability and other things. So that's just something to be aware of when you're comparing these applications. Blazor server tends to be an easier environment if you're porting an existing ASP.NET application. So if you've built some server-based like MVC style application and you want to migrate it to Blazor, Blazor server would be the simpler migration path for you. There is a perception, just generally in the industry, that server-based applications are more secure than client-server applications. And so that might be another reason why you choose Blazor server. And by some, WebAssembly is still viewed as experimental. But I'm going to explain in a minute that WebAssembly has actually been around for a long time, and it has a huge amount of industry support. So I don't know if this argument really is valid anymore. Some of the challenges around Blazor Server. So there is latency, right? So every user interaction that happens when you're running a Blazor Server application involves a network call, right? So whether you're clicking a button in the user interface or that application has to get data, there's always communication that's happening between the client and the server. And depending on the quality of your connection, there's going to be latency, which is going to affect your performance and scalability. There's also no offline support, meaning if you're wanting to build an application that runs in the browser and doesn't require a server connection, and there's plenty of application scenarios that are like this, you couldn't use Blazor Server because the only way it functions is by having the SignalR connection. So once the SignalR connection is lost, your application is not functional. From a scalability perspective, the server must manage multiple client connections. So every single client obviously has a persistent SignalR connection that is running and managing the state. And so there is scalability implications of that type of an architecture. Initially, people, when they looked at Blazor Server, they thought, okay, well, this, based on the architecture that I just described, there is serious performance issues that could occur in this, and it wouldn't scale. And, it's not even a viable option to look at if you're building a serious application, but that's actually not true. So there's been some benchmarking that's been done around Blazor Server, and it's actually quite capable. So using Azure as a benchmark environment. So even a fairly basic Azure instance, like a standard Azure instance with one CPU and 3.5 gigs of RAM could handle over 5,000 concurrent users, which 5,000 concurrent users is actually pretty significant. So if you're building, a line of business application for perhaps, for usage within a company, which is a pretty common scenario, Blazor Server is a great option for that. And then, of course, there are scalability options. So you can, increase the capability of the environment, like using a more robust Azure instance with 4 CPUs, 14 gigs of RAM, and that can scale to 20,000 concurrent clients. So depending on how much you need to scale, there is the ability to scale with Blazor Server. Turns out that the main bottleneck for increasing load on Blazor Server applications is the memory, because every SignalR connection actually maintains some state, which means it's consuming some memory, and that memory resides on the server. So as your application, as the number of concurrent users increases, so does the memory footprint. And then some people have said, why did Microsoft create this? Is a server single-page application framework even a good idea? Obviously, the technology is pretty functional. It's very capable. There's already a lot of applications being built on it. But is this a Microsoft-only thing? And is Microsoft committed to this in the long term? Well, it was quite interesting because the creators of Ruby on Rails, which is sort of Basecamp, which was formerly known as 37 Signals, came out with their own server-side single-page application solution in 2021 called Hotwire. And Hotwire actually mimics a lot of the same technology that Blazor Server uses, meaning it is using WebSockets. It's trying to avoid the use of JavaScript. It's running, for the majority of the workloads, running on the server. So certainly this isn't just a Microsoft thing. There's other solutions that are non-Microsoft that are also looking at this technology as a viable solution for building applications. And so it's important to note that it's not just a Microsoft concept, and that other solutions exist that are using it as well. So with that, we'll transition over to Blazor WebAssembly now and talk a little bit about the history of that solution. So main thing to note, it's not Microsoft Silverlight. So, it is not like Microsoft taking the IP that they created with Microsoft Silverlight and had, deprecated back in 2013 and repurposing it in a new way. It is not that, right? It is Blazor WebAssembly is a completely brand new technology that was built from the ground up to take advantage of some new industry standards. I guess the other thing that people sometimes get hung up on when it comes to Blazor WebAssembly is, because of the way that Microsoft Silverlight was basically abandoned by Microsoft kind of abruptly, and a lot of folks had, bought into it, started building applications on it, and then we're like kind of left with no migration path. There is concern about whether Microsoft is committed to Blazor WebAssembly in the long term as well. And of course, only time will tell. It remains to be seen. But I think that the thing with Blazor WebAssembly is there is more broad industry support just for the WebAssembly technology in general. And because of that, it doesn't seem like it's something that could be abandoned in the same way as Silverlight, which was very proprietary from Microsoft. So the main thing here is that there's been a lot of technologies over time that have been introduced by different companies, different organizations to run natively in the browser. So this has long been a goal, is to be able to run applications natively in a browser. And the reasons behind that are because, if you can run in the browser, you have native performance, right? That you have the fastest performance characteristics possible if you're running natively in the browser. Obviously, JavaScript runs natively in the browser, but there is it's not able to achieve that, like the fastest, most optimal performance because of the way that basically JavaScript works, which I'll explain in a minute as well. But so we've had ActiveX, we had Flex, Flash, Silverlight, and there's been, even attempts, more recently, Dart and, Google NACL. There's been a lot of attempts of coming up with some kind of a solution. The biggest problem traditionally has been that not all of these solutions that were intended to run natively in the browser would run on all browsers. And typically they would require a plugin. So the user would have to download a plugin, install that plugin, and then their application could run in the browser. And the industry kind of moved away from this concept of really supporting plugins. And of course, that's what led to the death of Microsoft Silverlight. Is there was this perception, well, and maybe it wasn't a perception, that these plugins could cause performance issues and security issues. And because of that, the hardware vendors decided that they weren't necessarily a great idea, so stopped supporting them. So anything that was like required a proprietary plugin was no longer deemed to be a really viable solution. So talking a bit more about WebAssembly. So if we go way back to 2010, so like we're talking 11 years ago, there's a company called Emscripten, which was founded by Alon Zakai. And Emscripten obviously has been an innovator for a long time. And they came up with a solution where they were using the LLVM compiler to compile C and C++ code to JavaScript. And so this technology actually was used by a lot of, client-intensive applications, meaning usually like games. So games that would run in the browser would needed that high performance. And so they would look to technologies such as Emscripten to provide that capability. But this is going way back to 2010. In 2011, Google announced the NACL, the native client, which was their attempt at creating like a technology that would allow you to run native code in the browser at near native speeds. And Google, pushed this for a while, created a number of applications around it, but it never really caught on, and they decided to abandon this in 2016 in favor, actually, of WebAssembly. Mozilla was really one of the pioneers behind WebAssembly, and back in 2013, Mozilla created a library called ASM.js, which was, it wasn't didn't have the full capabilities of the JavaScript language. It was a subset of JavaScript, but it could be used more as a low-level environment, like a target for compiling applications using Emscripten and LLVM. So using this approach, they were able to demonstrate that you could run C and C++ applications natively in the browser using the ASM.js JavaScript engine to accomplish that. And then later came WebAssembly. And so WebAssembly was the successor to ASM.js. And again, so Mozilla Foundation was one of the real pioneers behind WebAssembly. And it's often referred to now as the fourth official language of the web. So along with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, WebAssembly has really received, broad industry support. So the first release in a browser of WebAssembly was in Firefox 22 way back in 2015, so like 6 years ago. And I guess the benefit of WebAssembly over its precursor was that it could directly translate native instructions, was a more compact format, and it wasn't constrained by JavaScript itself because it really didn't have as strong a dependency on JavaScript as ASM.js. So that allowed WebAssembly to gain traction. And by November of 2017, WebAssembly was being shipped as part of all of the major browser releases. So Chrome, Firefox, Opera, and the Edge, so the newer Microsoft browsers as well. And I think the cool thing here is that WebAssembly is the first language since JavaScript that's able to run natively in a web browser, and it doesn't require plugins. So the fact that it's so widely available means that anyone can take advantage of it, and they don't have to worry about browser support, which is one of the major issues when it comes to previous technologies that required plugins. And it runs super fast. So, and then if we could fast forward a little bit more, so in 2019, there was an announcement about a WebAssembly system interface initiative. The goal of that was to standardize how WebAssembly code interacts with operating systems outside of the browser. So, I mean, even today, most people are focusing on WebAssembly for running applications in browsers, but there's no reason why it can't be used for running applications outside of the browser as well. And that was what the WASI was formed around, to create some standards so that you could run it, on like operating systems as well outside the browser. So that I think will be something that will be interesting to follow in the years to come. And in November 2019, the Bytecode Alliance was formed, which is a group of some of the largest players in the industry, and it's a nonprofit organization focusing on WebAssembly and WASI, and of course Microsoft is part of that. So if we look at JavaScript for a moment, and like why JavaScript can't run as fast as something like WebAssembly or something that is truly native. So how JavaScript works under the covers, of course, you have your inline JavaScript in your HTML page, or you have external resources, which are your JavaScript libraries. The browser pulls those in. It has to parse them. It has to compile them. It has to basically convert them into a form that it can then understand internally, and then it uses that to drive the refresh of the user interface. So all of that parsing work that's done and compiling work is fairly intensive, and that's a major limitation in terms of JavaScript runtime performance. How WebAssembly works is it basically bypasses the parsing and the compiling of the JavaScript, and it provides the instruction set in exactly the format that the browser needs to process it. So if we look at the amount of time it takes for performance, JavaScript processing, takes a much longer period of time because it has to do the parsing and compilation, whereas WebAssembly just does some basic decoding and then it can execute. So if you're wanting to build a very high performant web application, clearly WebAssembly is going to provide, better capabilities for you because it just doesn't have to do as much work as JavaScript does. The other thing to keep in mind is, Blazor WebAssembly isn't a Microsoft thing again. It's based on WebAssembly. WebAssembly, also known as Wasm, has a lot of industry support. So there's already solutions that are being created for most of the mainstream programming language that exists today. So things like Rust, Java, Go, Python, there is solutions for WebAssembly for all of these languages. So Microsoft And the Blazor solution, obviously focused on C#, is one of many solutions that rely on WebAssembly. I think the cool thing, though, with Blazor WebAssembly is that the fact that Microsoft got in early, with the proof of concept by Steve Sanderson back in 2017, and has built a complete and a robust kind of tool set around it, means that they, typically Microsoft is accused of being more of a follower than a leader when it comes to new technology. And I think in this case, they recognize the importance of WebAssembly early on and made investments in it. And now they have like a solution that is probably superior to some of the solutions that are available on other platforms. So Blazor WebAssembly was introduced by Microsoft in 2018. Obviously, it is basically taking that same Razor component model and allowing you to host your applications natively in the browser. How does this all work? So the original proof of concept that Steve Sanderson created was actually using a open source project called .NET Anywhere. And this is, it's a open source project that had been around for a long time. It had actually been abandoned. No one was maintaining it anymore. But it had the basic characteristics of what Steve Sanderson needed to prove that you could run C# on WebAssembly. So you could write a C# application, and in order to do that, you needed a runtime, a .NET Framework runtime that was compatible with WebAssembly that could then run in the browser. And .NET Anywhere did provide that. However, like I said, it was, that was not the solution for the future. That was a proof of concept. Coincidentally, if we think back to, around that same time frame, Microsoft had recently acquired Xamarin, and they had acquired Xamarin primarily for the mobile capabilities for building native mobile applications. But the team behind Xamarin, had also been maintaining Mono for a long time. And Mono, of course, is the cross-platform version of the .NET Framework. And they had already done some experimenting on building a Wasm version of Mono. And so, of course, that was a great coincidence, because that's exactly what Microsoft needed to build a more robust solution for WebAssembly. So underlying the Blazor WebAssembly solution is mono.wasm, which is now, of course, part of Microsoft and fully maintained, and a key part of the overall Blazor WebAssembly solution. So how does Blazor WebAssembly work? When a browser connects to the server, it downloads the Blazor WebAssembly. Well, it downloads your assemblies to the browser, and then it actually runs those assemblies natively in the browser by using the mono.wasm, so the WebAssembly compiled version of the .NET Framework, essentially. And all of the interactivity that happens with that application occurs in the browser itself. So this solution does not require a persistent connection between the browser and the server. So it does have some better scalability characteristics. It does emulate the traditional single page application architecture more closely, because like if you're running an application using something like React or Angular, of course, that JavaScript framework is running natively in the browser and doing all the user interface updates in the browser itself. And that's the way that Blazor WebAssembly works as well. The only time that it would call back to the server is to retrieve data, right? So making, AJAX calls. So why .NET in the browser? I think that from a business perspective, we already tackled this early on in this presentation, right? The resource availability of full stack developers, the need to kind of glue together front and back end technologies has some downsides. I personally am not a big fan of JavaScript, although of course JavaScript is super powerful in a lot of different ways. And actually, even when you're using Blazor, you still have to rely on JavaScript for some things. But I mean, my background is more writing C# backend applications. And I have never felt super comfortable in the front end with JavaScript. And so I really appreciate being able to write native front end code using C#. Also, I mean, some of the other downsides, I guess, of the current single page application frameworks that are based on JavaScript, or there's criticisms of them that they're becoming bloated over time, right? Like this is an example here, of 14,500, files that are part of like the node modules folder. So these frameworks have become very, very powerful over time with a lot of capabilities, but as a result of that, like any software, they start to become bloated. Because of that, that has performance characteristics. The larger footprint has memory, impacts. It takes longer to download to the browser, so that latency to the application spinning up takes longer. So there's a lot that comes from these frameworks being bloated. So what are some of the challenges around Blazor WebAssembly? Well, .NET libraries. So if you're imagining that when you're running Blazor WebAssembly, those DLLs need to be downloaded to the browser. And if you think about this, traditionally, DLLs were never expected to be transferred anywhere, right? They were meant to sit in the application bin folder and just be processed. So the size of the DLLs was never really an issue in the past. Well, now that you're wanting to transfer those to the browser, that is an issue. You certainly don't want big bloated DLLs being transferred over the wire, and the end user waiting for those to be received in order to actually see their application being rendered. So there's been a lot of work by Microsoft to try and optimize the size of these DLLs so that it requires less time to transfer them to the browser. There's all kinds of so IL. If you have the time to explore this, I mean, you can look at they're using compression, right? So they're using gzip and other forms of compression, Botley compression. They're also doing tree trimming, right? So they're trimming unnecessary aspects of libraries from the code, which is being transferred, using IL trimming, which was a big feature in .NET 5. So all of these things that they've been doing lately around reducing the size of DLLs is largely because of Blazor WebAssembly. Mono is always kind of lagged behind the general .NET framework in terms of capabilities. I believe that'll probably still be the case going forward. It'll probably still be at least a version behind, which means that if you're creating Blazor WebAssembly applications, you might not have the full set of features from the .NET framework or .NET Core that you are looking for, right? So you have to be aware of that. There is more limited debugging support for Blazor WebAssembly. Microsoft has tried to make some improvements in this area. I think in .NET 5 they announced some improvements, but it's still not a great debugging experience. So it's not as fluid as the experience that you've come to rely upon when it comes to server-based applications. Actually, for this reason, when I'm doing development for Blazor, I typically will build the application and debug it using Blazor Server. And then if I intend to run it on Blazor WebAssembly, I'll just flick the switch to run it on Blazor WebAssembly at runtime later. And it's also, I guess, the other thing with Blazor WebAssembly is it's not as part of an LTS release yet, right? It'll be part of an LTS release this November as part of .NET 6. And then, of course, there is the benefits of this Razor component model being so adaptable that it can be used in many ways. And so we already have Blazor Server and Blazor WebAssembly. You can already create a progressive web application based on Blazor. The Microsoft Blazor WebAssembly template has a PWA capability kind of enabled in it. That's not that difficult to do. But what's really cool and what's coming soon and should be part of .NET 6 is these hybrid and native capabilities. So the ability to build a hybrid application that and Microsoft actually released something called the Blazor Mobile bindings for Xamarin, which were, it's an experimental technology, but it demonstrated how you could run Blazor or Razor components in a web view within, a mobile scenario. And then Blazor native would actually be running like a Blazor or Razor components as part of a desktop application scenario in something like an Electron shell or something even more native than that. And so with all of these different hosting scenarios, you could, have a single code base that you could run anywhere from web all the way to desktop and mobile natively, which is pretty cool. I mean, this is very adaptable technology that I think we've been waiting for a long time. I already mentioned maybe the mobile Blazor bindings. This is, I think, becoming a first-class citizen as part of .NET 6. I don't know if that means it's part of MAUI or it's a separate thing from MAUI, but I believe it is supported in .NET 6. I'm going to skip through a lot, I think, of this content because the Blazor fundamentals are things that, if for most of you who have experimented with Blazor already, you're already familiar with. So how to get Blazor, what Razor components are, the component model behind Blazor. I think you're familiar with, obviously, Razor components are chunks of UI, and those UIs have capabilities where they can handle routing, they can handle the passing of parameters. There's event binding, property binding, and then some lifecycle events that are part of the overall component model. You get familiar with this concept, and you'll be up and running on Blazor in no time. Component rendering and how it works, I guess, is just a little bit more detailed on how the actual interactions happen, but we've already kind of described. But if you're running on WebAssembly, your entire application is running in the browser itself. So all of the user interface interactions are happening in the browser. So you get a very rapid sort of refresh loop within the browser itself. So that provides that interactivity for the end user. In Blazor Server, you have your C# code running on the server and interacting with the browser through SignalR. So there is a bit more of a latency and consideration at play here. How to use components, I'm gonna skip through these pretty quickly, but obviously you build your components and you utilize them as if they were standard kind of tags, much like you were familiar if you were building tag helpers or you were using web forms and those controls. There's a component lifecycle with actually not that many events at this point in time, so you only have to become familiar with a few main events that are part of component base. Obviously, if you're familiar with building web forms applications, there was a huge set of lifecycle events that could be taken advantage of in that environment. So this should feel familiar. I think one thing to note is under the covers, if you're interested in how this works. So the way that you develop your Blazor applications is you write, standard C# using the type of logic that you would expect for a web application, and then under the covers, when that application is compiled, it actually produces an intermediary file, which you can find in the obj debug folder. If you look inside of your Blazor application, and you'll see, like, if you actually take a look at the difference between your Razor file and the intermediary file that's created by Blazor, it's quite interesting. So everything is converted into using this build render tree method, which is kind of the fundamental of how Razor components work. And then you'll see this builder, and all of the markup is kind of built up using all of these very verbose commands. You can write this yourself, like you could write the code, like your Blazor code, in this manner if you wanted to, but obviously it's not nearly as readable or maintainable as the standard code that you're used to. So the one thing that I found valuable, though, is there's situations where you're just wondering how Blazor is doing something under the covers, or maybe wiring up some different events or things. And by opening the .g.cs file, that's the intermediary file that's created, you can see how Blazor does things under the covers, which is quite powerful in some ways. Blazor, obviously, or Razor components support routing, just using a simple @page directive. They support layouts using, like, you can inherit, kind of like the master page concept. So you can inherit from a layout. Supports data binding just by declaring variables in your code block and then referencing those variables with an @ sign. All this is very, like, so if you're familiar with like Razor syntax and you've been building like Razor pages, then all of this should be very familiar to you. And I think that Microsoft developed it in this way so that it's a pretty easy migration path. Like if you're a C# developer and you've been building MVC or Razor pages, moving to Blazor is not a big challenge at all. Supporting events for most of the major events, you can just provide a method like @onClick or @onChange, and then specify the name of your method that should be called when that happens, and it's pretty easy to wire things up. .NET Core in general has a big focus on dependency injection, and so of course Blazor has full support for dependency injection as well. It's got the standard .NET Core. It relies on the standard .NET Core DI container to register your services, and then you can pull them into your Razor components using the @inject directive. One of the other cool things that Blazor allows is, when you're building web applications, there still is a need sometimes for JavaScript. And so they provided a capability so that you can actually call directly from your C# code into to call a JavaScript method. So that's pretty powerful. So you can, call JavaScript, and that JavaScript method could even return a value which could come back to your C# code. And you can also do vice versa. So you can actually call C# from JavaScript as well. So this opens up a lot of possibilities for developers who need that interactivity between their C# code, which is running in the browser, and JavaScript code, which is running in the browser as well. So pretty powerful stuff. Dynamic components. So most of the examples you'll see from Microsoft, at least in terms of their documentation or their templates that they provide you, are all based on very static kind of examples where everything is kind of hard-coded, meaning like the examples that I just showed, like your routes are hard-coded in your Razor components, your tags are hard-coded. That's not always what's needed when you're building a more robust application. And so there is the ability to build dynamic components as well. However, in order to do that, you do have to get familiar with more of the native Blazor syntax around creating a builder and using that builder open component, closed component kind of syntax. I'm going to show you Octane in a minute, and Octane is 100% dynamic, and it uses this methodology for almost everything that it does. Question that comes up is, it's pretty cool that that Blazor supports multiple hosting models, right? It supports Blazor Server and Blazor WebAssembly, and it's going to support other hosting models. So can you write one application and have it run in multiple hosting models? And the answer to that question is yes, you can. However, you need to build your application appropriately in order to accomplish that goal. Essentially what that means is if you want to run in all hosting environments, you really need to build your application in a client-server model, a true client-server model, not using like the Blazor server architecture model, which really isn't client server. So, and the reason for that is if you just think about like the workloads of where things are happening. So let's say you built a Blazor application and you built it using Blazor server kind of techniques, meaning your Razor components calling your database directly because it's on the server, no problem. It's calling the file system to read a file directly. That's no problem. Then you decide that you want to take that application and you want to run it on WebAssembly. Well, it's going to download that DLL to the browser, and then the browser is going to execute it, and the code is going to try to access the database, which it can't do because it can't directly access the database. That's not possible because at that point it's running in the browser sandbox. So in order to access the database, it has to call an HTTP service, which exists on the server. So those are the things that you have to keep in mind. So if you want to build an application that runs on both hosting models without like any code changes, you need to build it in a client-server manner. So even your Blazor server application would need to still utilize HTTP services, or have some kind of an architecture that it could dynamically figure out what it needs to do at runtime, right? To either call a service or call the database directly. So there is some architecture that's involved in making an application that runs in both environments. You also have to pay attention to the fact that, and I mentioned this earlier, that not the full capabilities of .NET are not available in both hosting environments, right? You have a more limited set of functionality when you're running on Blazor WebAssembly. Although I wouldn't say it's very limited at all. It's pretty robust, right? It just doesn't have the very latest .NET enhancements. You do have to get familiar with HTTP client, and there's a new JSON parser that's been introduced, system.text.json, as opposed to using JSON.NET. At least in the earlier versions of Blazor, there were some reasons why JSON.NET couldn't be used as the JSON parser when running in the browser. And that's why Microsoft introduced a new JSON parser. So you have to get familiar with that. And then Blazor applications, at least from a user interface perspective, really force you to use asynchronous methodology so that the UI thread is never blocked, so that the user always has the most responsive experience. And so if you're not familiar with using asynchronous methods, you're going to have to become familiar with them in order to build a Blazor application. Because most of the native Blazor methods are all asynchronous. And with that, we're going to transition over to talking a bit about an actual application that was built using Blazor. So Blazor itself is an application framework, right? And what are application frameworks designed to do? Well, they're designed to accelerate web development, right? And they've tried to provide some standardization, and they try to automate the overhead of creating applications. So I'm sure you could build WebAssembly applications from scratch, right? Without the use of Blazor, but it would require a whole lot of work, and you'd be responsible for all that infrastructure that needs to be created. So Blazor's great in that it provides you a framework that you can build on to build applications that run on WebAssembly, that use a component model. But there's limitations to every framework. So a framework like Blazor only goes so far in terms of providing a set of services. There's a whole additional set of services on top of Blazor, which it'll probably never support because it's use cases that aren't really in its mandate to as a primary set of use cases that it cares about. So I guess this is the reason why I started working on a modular application framework for Blazor called Octane. Because there was a number of capabilities that I was hoping for as building blocks that I could build web applications on top of that are not part of Blazor currently and probably never will be part of Blazor. So the Octane framework was inspired by the work that I did on DotNetNuke. It utilizes a lot of the same concepts that were part of DotNetNuke, but obviously implemented them in a completely different and modern way. I'm also focusing on the fact that Octane is an application framework for building applications, not necessarily an application for building websites, like content-rich websites. So where .NET was used in multiple ways, right? It was, some people would use it as an application framework, and other people used it just as a CMS, right? A content management system for building websites. I am not focused on the content management capabilities at this point in time for Octane. That is not the primary use case for it. I think that there's already plenty of very capable content management systems that exist today, and there's no point in building another content management system. However, there are not a lot of robust web application frameworks for .NET Core. And so that's the problem that Octane is trying to solve. So allowing you to create modern web applications quickly, providing you with a more robust set of building blocks that you can rely on, written from the ground up using Blazor and .NET Core, supporting both Blazor Server and Blazor WebAssembly in a single code base, open source license, so MIT license. Actually, Octane is a member of the .NET Foundation, so the .NET Foundation actually owns the Octane source code. So that was an important aspect to make sure that it's that the maximum number of organizations would be able to use it. It has full localization capabilities that are built into it now. And it provides a lot of capabilities that are not currently available in Blazor. Well, what are those capabilities? Multi-tenancy is a big one. So there's many, many cases where you're building web applications and they need to be multi-tenant, meaning you want to run, multiple instances of the application using the same code base. And that is not something that Microsoft has really ever provided support for in any of their previous frameworks, and I don't expect they'll ever add it in Blazor either. So, but that's a key part of Octane. Dynamic routing. So in order to support multi-tenancy, you need to use a slightly different type of router. So Octane has its own router. It doesn't use the default router that comes as part of Blazor. You need a web UI framework to be able to construct your user interfaces simply. And of course, it uses Razor components. It uses all the standard Blazor capabilities, but it it basically does a lot of the heavy lifting of rendering a dynamic user interface based on Razor components. A modular architecture, meaning you can build applications that plug in to the framework very simply and easily. And those modular applications can be completely separate and isolated from the framework itself, which allows you to, update and maintain the framework independently from your own applications. It has a granular permissions model, which goes beyond what the traditional .NET Core provides you with, permissions or authorization for example, for your API methods. Octane has capabilities to create much more granular permissions. You can build themes that are customizable. So much different than, I guess, the basic layout capabilities that standard Blazor provides. The theming capability that's available in Octane is more advanced. It's got a whole administrative user interface that's already built out. That's part of the framework itself for managing a lot of the standard configuration of the framework. But because all the code is available and it's open source, it gives you a great example of a whole lot of different Razor components and how Razor components are built. So from an education perspective, the Octane framework is very valuable in terms of showing you how to do many, many different types of things within Blazor itself. It's a client-server architecture, so it's got a full headless API that the client interacts with, and it supports multiple databases, which I will show in a minute here. But from an architecture perspective, it is client-server. So if we start at the bottom here, you've got your server that's built on .NET Core and EF Core. Octane's got its own sort of repository layer, which works exclusively with EF Core and interacts with databases. I think that the interesting thing here to note is that the multi-tenant capability in Octane, it does not just support a shared tenancy model, meaning like you can have an application and all of your tenants exist in the same physical database. It actually has an isolated tenancy model that it supports as well. So you can have multiple databases. So you can have an independent database for each tenant that's still managed out of the same application framework instance. So that's a capability that didn't exist in DNN that's more advanced, I guess, in Octane. Octane has a full REST API, support for Swagger. It also uses the iScheduled service capability in .NET Core to allow you to run scheduled jobs. So if you have asynchronous processing that needs to be done on the server, you can build a scheduled job that'll run, and you can manage the schedule for that. And then if we switch over to the client, it's all based on, of course, Razor components, so it can run on Blazor Server or Blazor WebAssembly. It's got a service layer, which makes it sort of a nice way of interacting with your backend APIs using strongly typed methods and models. And then you can spin up as many. It still uses the notion of a site as being sort of the grouping mechanism for a tenant. And each site can have its own database or be in a shared database. And then you have your modules, right? So these are your independent modules, and modules are built using standard Razor components. In the Octane 2.1 release, which was just over, I think, just over a month ago, the big feature that was released was support for multiple databases. So originally, when Octane was created, it only supported SQL Server. And so one of the big pieces of feedback was that, it's a .NET Core based application, and so it can run on multiple platforms, right? It can run on Windows or Linux or Mac. But the fact that it only supported SQL Server kind of limited its usefulness. And so it'd be better to support the most popular relational databases on other platforms other than Windows as well. So support was added for SQLite, MySQL, and PostgreSQL. And that was, like I said, in just Octane version 2.1. So that capability has only been available for about a month. But it's actually pretty cool in that if you're building modules for Octane, you build them using EF Core, and you build them using the standard EF Core migrations. And behind the scenes, I mean, your module would be capable of running on any of these 4 databases where there's providers that have been built for Octane. So it's this notion of, you only need to write one set of database code, and it'll work on multiple databases. I think that was always the vision behind EF Core, but I haven't seen too many really solid implementations of that. And so I'm really proud that we're able to have that in Octane. It was actually one of my colleagues that I worked with closely from DNN, Charles Nurse, who was actually the chief architect for DNN, who added this capability in Octane 2.1. So pretty happy with that. The community and code for Octane is available on GitHub. So if you can go to the Octane framework repository, the most recent release was version 2.2. That was earlier this week. And a lot of that version included support for upgrading to Bootstrap 5 from Bootstrap 4. But yeah, there's a lot of capabilities that you can take advantage of. So to actually show you the application and to demonstrate something, so I have Visual Studio open here, and I have the set of code that basically this is the latest set of code from the dev branch in the GitHub repo. You'll see that there's a number of different projects here. There's a client project, a server project, and a shared project. The client project, as you would imagine, contains a lot of components, all of the Razor components. So if we look in the modules folder, we'll see that there's an admin folder, and all of the admin functionality and Razor components are all here. So index.razor, that's a Razor component. The files module has a number of components that are part of it. The jobs module has a number of components. So you can look at these Razor components and you can see how they're structured. And it's just standard Razor components. And it's using the standard model that Microsoft has, where you've got your markup here, and then you've got your code, of course, at the bottom as well. And so got a lot of examples of Razor components that you can look at that are part of the open source project. It's also got the service layer. So all of the services for calling backend APIs, there's services that have been defined for them. So this would be the APIs that you could take advantage of just by using dependency injection and pulling in the necessary services into your Razor components. You've got your server project where you have your API controllers. So they're all defined. You've also got your repository. So uses the repository pattern for doing data access, and of course the repository utilizes EF Core for all of its data access. Migrations are all defined in the migrations folder. So and this was the new capability added to do migrations so that you could support multiple databases. I think that's all I want to show there. And then of course your shared project contains your models. So the models that are shared between the client and the server. So it doesn't use back-end models and view models for the front end. It uses one set of models. This was just an architectural decision that was made early on, and the whole application kind of is based on this model. So if we look at this server project and we go into the app settings.json file, which is open here, we can see that it's got pretty minimal, I guess, amount of information in it. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to remove this connection string and save it. And now, and we're so noticing we're running the runtime. So it's for supporting the different hosting models for Blazor. There's a runtime node, which is in the app settings.json file where you can specify server or WebAssembly. So I'm going to be running it on server initially here. By not specifying a connection string, the application is going to recognize when it runs that it needs to create a database. So it's going to basically do a new installation, and it's going to provision the database for me. So if I run this application now, it's going to come up with a wizard, which is going to show me the parameters that I can enter for creating my initial installations. So version 2.2, I can see here that by default, it chooses local DB, which is the SQL Server local DB. But you also have the ability to choose MySQL, PostgreSQL, or SQLite if you want to. So you can set up your initial installation on any of these databases. By default, I'm just going to accept the default values. I'm going to create my initial host account, and I'm just going to, actually, I'll just enter my email address. Use a personal email. All right, so if I enter this basic information and I say install now, it's going to go ahead and it's going to create the database for me, and it's going to provision it with the schema using the migrations, and it's going to create some initial content for me. So it created a few pages for me by default with some content, which of course I can remove. So it created a home page, and if we look at this page, it's got a chunk of content here. It's got another chunk of content here. These are content that are managed by individual modules that are part of Octane. It's got a private page, so again, you can define pages through the user interface, which are available to different roles. So instead of hard coding like the roles which have access to different parts of your application in the Razor components themselves, like I said, Octane is all dynamic and you manage that through the user interface. And it has a personalization capability as well. So let's say you wanted to create like a portal type of capability where each user gets a specific version of a page, and then they can customize it to add their specific modules that they want on that page. It has that capability as well. If we look at some of the user interface functionality, if I click on this pencil icon, the user interface changes and it shows me the different areas of the page which are available for me to inject content into. So by default, everything is in this admin pane. There's a module here, another module here, another module here, and then down below you've got all these different panes that you could move in modules to. So let's say I want to move this module instance to the right pane, right? So it actually moved it. It's sort of instantaneously for me. So that's how you can move content around within your theme. When you're in edit mode, you also have the ability to manage things like settings for this particular module. If I go in there, I can see I can manage the title of that module. I can manage the permissions of who's allowed to view it and edit the capabilities. And you've got some different settings that you can enter as well. So this is all very familiar in terms of the concept. if you're familiar with DNN, because it operated in kind of a similar manner. If I go out of edit mode, I can hover over this gear icon up here, and it gives me access to my control panel. So my control panel gives me access to an admin dashboard where I can access all the admin functionality. I can also access some different page management capabilities. So if I say I want to edit the aspects of this particular page, there's a lot of different metadata that you can enter. Again, you can specify permissions about who's allowed to view this page, who's allowed to edit the aspects of this page. And I can specify aspects related to the theme as well. You also have the ability to add modules, so additional module instances to the page. So by choosing the module. And so let's go to the admin dashboard now. So in the admin dashboard, this is what I was talking about. So all the administrative modules that come as part of the framework. So to manage different aspects of the framework itself. So I can go into my site settings, right? I have the ability to specify a lot of different configuration for the site. I can specify which, what the logo is. If I have a fave icon, the theme that's being used, I can specify my SMTP settings for doing notifications, which has got a whole capability in the system for managing, for sending notifications. I can enable this as a progressive web application if I want to. And it tells me some information about this tenant as well. And like we're using a local DB here, just with integrated security. So there's a lot of functionality. So you can manage your pages, manage users. You can manage profiles, which are your user profiles. So you can specify an arbitrary, like as many different profile settings as you want that can be collected through the user's profile. And each of these have, a lot of different ways that you can specify whether they're required, what their length is. You can lay out basically your user profile page. You can set up your roles and assign them to your users. You've got a full file management capability as well, where you can specify folders where you're going to be able to upload content. And there's different types of folders. So when you add folder, you have the ability to specify that the folder is either private or public. Private folders means the files are going to be stored in a location that are inaccessible unless the user has access permissions provided. You also have a public folder where, again, essentially the files are private, but if the user knows the URL, they can actually get access to it because it's stored in the www root area. But yeah, this is basically a full sort of asset management capability for uploading files, and you can take advantage of that. You've got a full event log to keep track of all of the different events that are happening within the application itself, and it's filtered, of course, by site. So these are all of the different events that have happened on this site. So it's got like basically a full auditing capability that's part of the application. If I look at the details for this, it'll tell me all of the information about this particular event, including like things like what URL was invoked, and it uses the Seralog type of format where you can define a template, and the values are reflected in the event log and preserved in the event log. Module management. Well, so actually, let's site management. So if you want, so like I said, it's multi-tenant. So if you want to add additional site, right now there's only one default site that's been created. I can say I want to add a site. It uses the DNN concept of aliases. So you'd have to have a unique way of accessing a site. And so you can create a site, and then for the alias, I could use this localhost address, which I'm running on, but I can actually put a subfolder on it. So I could say, site 2. And that means that this unique URL is what's used for accessing this specific site. And like we said before, you have the ability to use shared tenancy. So when I choose what tenant this site is going to be created in, I can say I want to create it in the master tenant, which is the default database that we created when we installed, or I can say create new tenant. And when I say create new tenant, I can give it a new tenant name, and I could actually create this tenant in SQLite if I wanted to, if I provide the details for SQLite. So this is how you can create sites that have different databases, and not just this, not the same database engine, but even different database engines. So that's how you can create multiple sites. Module management. So this is a list of all of the different modules that are part of this particular installation. And if I want to install additional modules, I can go into the module management area and say install. There is integration with a registry service that's remote, and basically the packages are hosted on NuGet.org. So for example, there's a blog module that's available. If I wanted to install this blog module into my installation, so this was a blog module that was obviously created separately from the framework itself. I just have to say I want to download it, and once I download it, then I can click to install it. And so there's like this seamless installation experience, and I would expect that there's going to be a lot more modules that are created over time that people who are building applications can take advantage of for additional functionality. So this is it's integrated with the NuGet service. You can also upload a module package, and it's all based on NuGet packages. Similarly, if I go into theme management, I can see that these are all the different themes that I have installed currently. If I want to install another theme, there would be a list of them here as well. But there's only sort of one theme right now, that boot swatch theme, and I've already installed it. Language management. So obviously by default it has English. I can add additional languages if I want to. And there is an actual translations repo that's in the Octane organization on GitHub, and there's a number of languages that have already been created. I think 6 or 7 languages. So I think there's French, German, Swiss. There's a lot. Persian. I mean, there's a lot of language that have already been created. So localization is a key part. We've got the ability to create scheduled jobs, like I already mentioned before. SQL management. So if I want to manage directly, like if I want to interact with my backend database through the user interface, I can do that. I just have to specify which tenant I want to interact with, and then I can execute SQL commands. I'm only allowed to do this because I'm logged in as the most authorized user, the host user. I can see system info related to this site. So I'm running the Octane Framework 2.2 on .NET 5. It tells me some information about my installation. I also have the ability to specify some different configuration if I want to enable some things. You'll see here that Swagger is enabled by default. I can access Swagger by clicking this link, and I've got my full Swagger API UI that's rendered here. And then it does have a system update capability as well, where basically if you want to update the framework using the latest version, it'll tell you if there's a version available, and it can actually update the framework in a really seamless way, much like you can do with, I guess, like WordPress or other types of frameworks that have this capability. So it's got a lot of robust functionality that's available in the admin area. As far as getting started with development, and I think that probably Michael Washington covered a lot of this in his session that he did at the conference, but one of the goals behind Octane was, it's a development framework, so we need to make it easy for developers to get up to speed quickly. So we've created a module creator capability. So if I go into my admin dashboard and I go into my module management area, I can say that I want to create a module. And it opens up this dialog where I can enter some information about the module that I want to create. So let's say I want to create a module, and I just enter some basic information about the module. So this is like the, who owns the module. Actually, I should probably say it's, that. Give it a module name, and then I can select a template. By default, there's only one template that's provided, the default module template. And I can select which framework version of Octane I want this module to be built on. And I'm going to use 2.2, which is the one I'm running right now. And it tells me where it's going to create the source code for this module, because it's going to scaffold out a whole set of source code for me. And so if I say create module, it says the source code for my module has been created at the location specified below. So let's take that location. And then, of course, it needs to be compiled in order to make it functional. So if I go into, let's go in here. Let's go to that location. And we can see that it created for me a whole lot of scaffolded code, a solution file, created all of my client project, my server project, and my shared project. So let's go ahead and open this project. Actually, I can shut down this other project here. All right, so I've opened my project that was scaffolded, and it, of course, it used the configuration that I provided in the module creator to create files and folders with the appropriate names and namespaces, so that it's customized to my specific needs. I got a client project. And if I open that, we can see that it created some Razor components for me in the right format. If I look at my server project, it created basically a controller project for me. It created my repository for me, and it created migrations for me. So it created everything I need to basically create a module. If I go into my index page here, see that it's just standard Razor markup. The idea with this as well is it makes it really easy to compile and get your assets in the appropriate location. So there's this package project which is created as well. When I compile this module in debug mode, it's going to, as a post-build step, it's going to execute this debug.cmd file. If we look at that file, it's going to xcopy the DLLs and PDB files that are part of this module to my Octane server instance, so that the Octane framework is aware of them and can utilize them. Similarly, if I compile this module in release mode, it's going to execute this release.cmd file. And in that case, it's actually going to pack the results of this module into a NuGet package using this new spec that was generated for me. So including all of the DLLs and PDBs that I need. So, so this is the easiest way to create a releasable package, and it actually copies that package to my Octane framework so that it can be installed by default. So I'm gonna go ahead and just use the debug method, and I'm gonna build this. So build this solution, and by building the solution, it's going to build various DLLs and then copy them over because of that debug.cmd file. So it says it worked. That's great. I'm going to go back to my Octane instance now, and I'm going to run it. So when you run Octane on startup, it's going to automatically recognize, hey, there's a new module that exists in the bin folder. And if there's any database-related migrations that need to be run, it's going to run them automatically for you so that this module is fully functional. So if I go, let's go to my private page. I go to my admin dashboard. I'm going to look at my modules, and I see I have my test module here. I choose my test module. I'm going to add an instance of that module to my page. So it added it. Right now, there's obviously no content, but the fact that it shows no test to display, it means that it interacted with the database to check the table that was created to see if there were any tests, and there weren't any. I'm going to add a test. So I'm just going to add some basic content here, save it. And so basically I have a fully functional database-driven module that is running fully in Octane simply by creating the scaffolded module. And of course, once you have a great starting point, you can go back and you can customize that module to actually do, what your specific business purpose is. So similarly with modules, you can do the same thing with themes. So you can go in and you can create a theme using the theme creator, and you can choose the default theme template, and it'll create a theme for you as well in exactly the right format with all the scaffolded bits that you need, and then you can customize it. So we really wanted to make it easy for developers to get up and running quickly. Yeah, I think that, I mean, there's a lot of functionality to take advantage of as part of the framework. And it provides like some very powerful building blocks so that you don't have to build a lot of, custom capabilities yourself. You can rely on, things, on building blocks that are already part of the framework. Yeah. So with that, I think that kind of wraps things up. I probably ended up going longer than I expected, but I hope that was a good overview of both Blazor and Octane.
It definitely was, Shaun. Thank you for such a brief and how do you phrase it, an extensive go through Blazor and Octane. You don't get to know a lot of background about stuff so easily. So it was a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions there in the chat window. So let's go through them.
Okay. I can't really see them, but so if you read them out, I can do my best to answer.
Sure. So before going to the Q&A, there's something that I have for our attendees. So 2 lucky attendees will stand a chance to win an ebook of web development with Blazor written by Jimmy Engstrom from our sponsors pack. So so how does it work is more over like Shaun gets to select 2 of his favorite questions that I speak to him. So the person who have asked that, they are gonna get this particular ebook from us. So guys, please stay with us. I would need your email address to share it with you. So if you haven't asked a question yet, do mention it in the chat window. So start the Q&A. So let's go with the first question. So it's by Prince. So as I said that using SignalR for every communication is not good practice. So do you think that this will be a success using the same fundamentals? Maybe his question is more towards the Blazor server side.
Mm-hmm. And so, sorry, can you repeat the question again? I'm not sure I caught the gist of it.
I'll repeat it again. So as I said that using SignalR for every communication is not a good practice. So do you think that this will be a success using the same fundamentals?
Yeah, so I don't know. Maybe I did say that it's not a best practice, but maybe that's that was a bit too extreme. So it is a very capable application model. There are a lot of application. I think so. I think that in a recent survey that I saw of people who are using Blazor already, it was pretty much an even split of those folks who are using Blazor Server versus Blazor WebAssembly. So, 50% of the people are actually building solutions on Blazor Server. I think that it's not really a limitation that it's using SignalR. SignalR is very powerful, right? And it is a very responsive technology. And there are certain benefits that you get with Blazor Server. Much easier debugging support is a big one, right? And once you get into developing Blazor applications, you'll find that you want that robust debugging capability that you're used to, and you get that with Blazor Server. From a scalability perspective, you saw the metrics, like even with a standard Azure instance, right? 5,000 concurrent users is pretty decent, and you can scale it up from there. So, and that's not even utilizing like the more serious, like you can utilize the Azure SignalR backplane service, right? Which is like a really robust enterprise level service for scalability. But what I was talking about in those metrics that I shared was just a standard Azure instance, right? A standard app service. So it can even scale pretty well with that. So I think Blazor Server is a viable technology that is here to stay.
I hope it answers, Prince. So yeah, and it's also useful for browsers which don't support WebAssembly yet, like Internet Explorer will never support it. So Blazor Server is a viable option there.
Yeah, Actually, it's interesting that you mentioned that. So with the latest version of Octane, we moved to Bootstrap 5, and Bootstrap 5 has no dependency on jQuery anymore, and it also doesn't support Internet Explorer anymore. So it seems like Internet Explorer is getting kicked to the curb.
So true. It's going retired, to be honest. So can't expect much from them.
Yeah.
So let's move on to the next question. Is by Luca. So he is asking that, do you think it will be possible in the future to have Blazor interacting with DOM without the need of JS interop?
I don't think so. I think that that JS interop is going to be a requirement in the future as well. It's fundamentally, right, the technologies, they run in a different kind of way, and so the calls kind of have to be marshaled between them. I don't think that there is any other way well, unless there's some technical capability that's coming, but I can't think of a way that you'd be able to achieve that that interop without that layer. And for those, and I guess that's something I should probably mention as well. For those people who are very comfortable with JavaScript and are used to like sprinkling a lot of JavaScript into their user interface, it does take some getting used to with Blazor, because when you build a Blazor application, essentially Blazor owns the DOM at that point, and so it will do some interesting things. So if you've included JavaScript, like inline JavaScript code within your Razor components, sometimes it'll just ignore, well, most of the time it'll just ignore it altogether. Sometimes I think there are some tricks to try and get it to actually recognize it, but it's really not a supported method. It's Microsoft actually recommends people don't do that. Like, don't use inline JavaScript in your Razor components. So you do have to kind of adjust your mindset. So if you want to take advantage of JavaScript, then you're being told to use JavaScript interop.
I hope it answers Luca. And let's move on to the next question. So it's again by Prince. So he's asking that, do we need to specifically use Blazor server with Blazor WebAssembly? Can we have some permutation combination with server as .NET Framework or core and Blazor WebAssembly? I think this should be possible, right?
Yeah,
For the second one.
Absolutely. Yeah, they're independent hosting models. So it's a capability that allows you to run Razor components in either hosting model, but you can't run on both at the same time.
Right. And it seems like our friend Jeremy did answer that.
Yeah, so you have to choose one hosting model that you're going to run your application in, whether it's WebAssembly or server. Unless the person who's asking was saying, could you be able to, like, within the same application, mix and match, right? Have some components that are running on WebAssembly and some that are running on server. That's not possible currently. Just because you have to specify your hosting models. Well, actually, that's an interesting question.
Well, if it is about reusability, then definitely we can. Like, we can, if while building our Blazor server applications, we take into the consideration that we want to port these components again in a WebAssembly app. Then, if we design it well, then we can reuse our components in our Blazor WebAssembly app as well as the server app. So
yeah, and that's obviously Octane has a single set of components that can run in either, right? And that was the whole point of it. Is like that I really liked is one reusable set of components.
That makes sense. So should we move on to the next question? I hope it did answer,
Sure.
Prince. Okay. So there's one more question by him. So can we have microservices as a backend with Blazor WebAssembly?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's no reason why you couldn't use microservices. I mean, I think that the notion of microservices is sometimes kind of fuzzy, right? People, I don't know specifically what he might be referring to by microservices, because sometimes people have different definitions. But if you have independently, I guess, hosted APIs, that there's no reason why your Blazor application can't call them. The only thing that you have to make sure that you put in place is some kind of a security mechanism, right? So that you'd have to have some kind of an authentication system or authorization system that would flow between the Blazor application and the backend microservices. But I mean, obviously those technologies exist, so yeah, there's no reason why you couldn't. The same way that you build there's no reason so you can build a React or an Angular front end that uses microservices. There's no reason why you couldn't do the same with Blazor WebAssembly.
Well, with microservices as an API, I have something coming into my mind. So micro frontends are also something that has been coming into the picture of late. So do you think it is possible to run our Blazor WebAssembly solution as a micro frontend?
So I guess so micro frontends solve a number of different problems, right? So basically, one of the traditional problems with single page applications is, you'd have one big monolithic front end, and then you'd have your back end split out into microservices. And so with micro front ends, you're breaking up your user interface into smaller reusable or smaller deployable pieces as well, right? And then those pieces are being combined together to form a larger user interface at runtime. That's actually what Octane is doing as well. I mean, each of that module that we just created, completely separate backend and user interface, and then at runtime, it's actually rendering the user interface. So it's essentially a micro front end capability, right? The only difference is it's not using JavaScript; it's using Blazor, so compiled C#, right? So I guess it depends on what your definition of a micro front end is, because it seems that what I just showed you seems to demonstrate a micro front end capability, right, from a conceptual perspective.
That makes sense. So let's move on to the next question. So it's on Octane. Looking at the timestamp, I think it's on Octane. So SK wants to ask you, does it support other DBs such as Cosmos DB? I remember we were discussing something about it before the session started. So
Cosmos DB is essentially a NoSQL solution, right? It's an Azure NoSQL service. So Octane is designed based on a relational database model. So I don't think it would work with Cosmos DB.
What if somebody wanted to extend it by adding up a module which can again use the SDKs for Cosmos DB that is given by Microsoft? Is it possible to extend it by creating a new module for that?
So yeah, so obviously there's the 4 databases that are supported right now, and there is a way that you could build additional providers. And a provider, someone's asked already about building an Oracle provider, so you could build a provider, and then you also provide the front end Razor component for capturing the configuration details that are specific to that database. And then you would also need to include the configuration for that in the database. So I'll show you here, the available databases in the app settings. It defines all of the different databases that are supported. And it has sort of 2 types, right? This is the provider, and this is the UI that's being used. And so that's all that would have to be provided. So you could create another one for any other database you wanted to support.
That makes sense. So somebody needs to build a wrapper around it to support Cosmos DB.
Yeah, I just don't know what the complexities might be, because like I said, Cosmos DB is a NoSQL solution, right? So it might have some challenges in order to make that work, because all of these database providers are all relational. And the application framework, like the framework itself, relies on some of the intrinsic capabilities of relational databases. For example, like cascading deletes and things like that are all of these database providers support that. And so Octane framework relies on that. So if you use something like Cosmos DB, which doesn't support that, you'd have to come up with some alternate solution. And I don't know what the complexity might be.
That makes sense. So that's a no for you, SK. So maybe in the future we can have a potential solution. Maybe you can contribute one.
Yeah,
So,
and I guess I would need to understand why Cosmos DB. Like you can use Azure SQL. That works perfectly well and very scalable. So why would you need to use Cosmos? I mean, it seems like you need to understand why specifically you would need to use Cosmos.
probably you can create an issue in the GitHub repo of Octane and explain it better so that Shaun can have a look at it and understand the use case.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to the next question. So is on how does it integrate with Azure AD? So do we have an Azure AD support?
No, so that's something that's still on the roadmap. Is support for other authentication methods. Right now, it only has like well, it uses the .NET Core identity system, and it has local user accounts. You can log in. It uses cookie-based authentication. But yeah, that's something that's on the roadmap that will be in a future version. Is support for like at least Azure AD B2C, like social logins, like being able to log in using your Facebook or your Twitter, or, GitHub identity. That capability is something that a lot of folks have asked for.
So maybe we can get it in Octane 3.0 because there were a couple
Yeah.
of questions regarding the same area. So
Okay.
let's move on to the next question. It's by Daniel. So is there any settings I have to do on my system before running Blazor and Octane? Maybe he's asking how to get started with running an Octane application using Blazor.
You just need to install .NET 5. Yeah, so if you go to the Octane repo, you can see on the main repo page, there's instructions on how to get started, like what are the dependencies you need to install. Essentially, it's the same set of dependencies that you would need to install if you want to create any Blazor application.
That makes sense. So let's move on to, okay, we have a compliment here. So Jeremy is saying that, yes, this was awesome, Shaun. Great to hear about the history of Blazor.
Cool.
People are loving it, Shaun. We really missed you at the conference.
No, I'm glad. Like the history is like you said, it's interesting, right? It's like we dive in and start using new technology and don't know sometimes why it was created or how it was created or who created it, and it's sometimes nice to know the background.
That's true. We also give some credits to the people who came up with such ideas in the first place.
Yep. Yeah,
So
the
moving
true
on.
innovators. Yeah.
True. So let's move on to the next question. So it's by Leonardo. So he has a couple of questions. So we'll go through each of them. So how powerful is the database management? Can I write SQL in there and query through my data?
So that must be an Octane question. So yeah.
Yep.
Yep. You can write standard SQL queries, and it executes it against that. So whichever, you have to choose the tenant. So you have to be kind of aware of the nuances, right, of the SQL dialect of that tenant. So if it's if the tenant is using SQL Server, then you use that flavor of SQL. If you're using MySQL, then it would be that flavor of SQL. But yeah, it executes the SQL statement against the database, and it'll show you the results in a simple kind of a table form. I mean, it's meant more for like doing simple maintenance, right, of database entities. It's a fairly handy capability to have. Like it was something that was always part of DNN as well.
What if somebody had to write up a complex query, maybe execute a stroke prog to get some results? So is it possible?
I mean, yeah, you could call a stored proc. Obviously, you'd have to make sure your environment's configured so that it's able to actually execute it on the server side. And depending on whether or not results are returned, the thing is, so Octane itself, avoids the use of stored procedures or raw SQL as far as its regular data access. It exclusively uses EF Core. So it basically allows EF Core to do all of the data interaction, right?
Okay, I hope it answers, Leonardo. But I think EF Core also provides a mechanism through which we can execute raw queries and express procedures.
Yeah, you're right about that. It's just, yeah. So Octane doesn't do that. I know that. So there's, folks who are building custom modules for Octane already, and they've asked that question too. Do I have to use EF Core? Can I use Dapper? Right? If I want to use Dapper, can I use? Can I write raw SQL queries? Absolutely, you can. There's nothing restricting you from doing that. In fact, like if you want to build a module and you want to, instead of using EF Core migrations, you want to use SQL scripts, right? And actually write a SQL migration script manually, you can do that. It has support for that as well, because that's actually how Octane was originally working prior to adding the support for multi-databases. So of course, if you go down that path, you're not going to be able to have the multi-database support, right? As soon as you start using SQL scripts and using raw SQL, most likely you're limiting yourself to a specific database. And that might be just fine, because you might have no intention of using anything but that one database anyways. So, but yeah, it doesn't restrict you in what you can use for data access.
That's great. It allows you to extend your application depending upon your requirements. So let's move on to the next question. So it's again by Leonardo. So can I combine other Blazor UI frameworks with Octane? Maybe something like Blazor or Blazorize, or else something from Telerik.
Yes, absolutely. So so one of the goals of Octane is to not have to very much limit the number of third-party dependencies that the framework relies on. So one of the only dependencies it has is Bootstrap, because it needed some kind of a UI framework to at least deal with the admin UI. However, a lot of people want to use things like the third-party UI controls from Infogistix or Telerik or Syncfusion or others, and there's also a lot of new ones that are specific to Blazor as well, like the ones that you mentioned, and you can absolutely use those with Octane. There's a number of articles that have been written. That actually Michael Washington, who presented at the conference on Octane, he has a blazorhelpwebsite.com, and he has a number of articles that he's written on how to integrate third-party component libraries with Octane.
Sure, folks can just jump in there and look at ways how we can do that. So
Yeah, I think he has articles on Syncfusion and Radzen, and I think there's a few others that he's already documented.
I think so. I need to go through his website again to confirm the same.
Yeah, he's got a lot of good articles on there. He's a smart guy.
He's a regular. He's a regular blogger also. You get new content every day.
He's a very good writer. Like, I mean, even back from the days when I knew him from DNN, he writes very thoughtful and like very well explained instructions on how to do things. Right? He writes super helpful information for other developers.
Well, he also has I guess 3 books now. 3 books now on Blazor itself.
Yeah, he's been busy.
It's true that. So let's move on to the next question. So it's again by Leonardo. So can I run Octane with a local database for devs to manage the database through the UI?
Yes. Yeah, LocalDB is one of the options that's supported. Yeah.
So it answers Leonardo. Let's move on to the next question. Okay. So it's from Yash. So he's saying that there's a lot of confusion about Blazor. As you said, Blazor needs JavaScript, but some say there's no need JavaScript or Angular. So what should we learn, Blazor or Angular? Like, where's the future? Maybe he's confused over there with the roadmap. Like, how should he approach things?
Well, I think that so Microsoft recognizes that Angular is a very like popular solution, and there's a lot of industry support for it. It's been around for a long time. It's very mature. So I think that Microsoft still has to provide guidance on how to build .NET applications using Angular, right? So that there still is templates that they're providing for how to spin up a single page application using Angular on the front end and C# for your services on the back end. But then as an alternate, they're providing Blazor. So it's never going to be like one solution. You have to choose the right solution for your needs. So it's up to each individual to choose what's the best technology for their case. Like let's say you have a bunch of back-end developers, right? And you need to migrate an existing application. Well, making them learn Angular and expecting them to be like become immediate experts on JavaScript is probably not realistic. So maybe that's a case where they would be better off using Blazor. Whereas like maybe you're an agency that does a ton of JavaScript, and you're not really strong on back-end development techniques. Well, in that case, maybe you should be using Angular. Like there is definitely not a one size fits all, right? And that's why Microsoft provides multiple solutions.
Okay, I was on mute. So that makes sense in a way because even I had some trouble working with JavaScript in the beginning of my career. So Blazor makes my work really easy. Like I made my whole blog app using Blazor itself. So it helped me build it up in 7 days in a week. So it increases your productivity as a .NET developer. So there
Yep.
are JavaScript somewhere. So you need to have the fundamentals. You don't need to be an expert, but you need to at least know the fundamentals, right?
Yeah, and I've found like because of the JavaScript interop capability, like so for example, Octane does have. Let me show you something here. So in Octane, there is if we look in the JavaScript, there's an interop file here, and there's a lot of general sort of JavaScript functions that are in here, like getting and setting cookies, or if I want to update the title of the page, right, or if I want to update the metadata, rather than having the developers write this JavaScript, there's also a front end nice wrapper around it. If I look in the UI folder, interop here. So if I want to call set cookie from my Razor component, I just call a .NET method. And it, in turn, of course, calls JavaScript. But so instead of having to write JavaScript, there's probably going to be more and more sort of library methods that'll be available for .NET developers so that they don't actually have to deal with JavaScript itself, right? They'll be calling .NET a .NET method, and under the covers it's using JavaScript, but they don't even really know that. But that's how they can get some of that interactivity that JavaScript provides.
That's true. Maybe as Blazor matures along, over the time, probably we'll have more components that will help us, reduce our dependency on writing, JavaScript functions to get our functionality.
Yeah, I know that in .NET 5, Microsoft already increased like the number of methods, right, that use JavaScript under the covers, but just making it easier for developers to just call framework-based methods to do what they need to do within Blazor and not have to write the JavaScript themselves.
That's true. That's true indeed. But the JS interop also comes in handy if you already have a huge chunk of your own custom JavaScript library which you use across your projects. You can always leverage that instead of reinvesting more effort, more time, and building all those stuff.
Yep. Yeah,
Okay.
like this here, like the method here for uploading files asynchronously. Like at this, the file uploader, right? And it basically does chunking of the files into chunks. Like you wouldn't want to have to write this kind of JavaScript, right?
That's true. It's always better to have have existing codes to do your task, which you can just call and leverage the power to get your work done.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we have one more question from here. So one question I want to clear that: can I do all with Blazor just as Angular? Like, is it possible to do everything that I can do with an Angular application with a Blazor application?
I don't see why not, but I don't know of any specific examples right now off the top of my head that might be impossible to do in Blazor that you can do in Angular. I guess there may be some, but I'm not aware of them.
True. Maybe we may not have some components that are there in Angular because Angular is very old, to be honest. With respect to Blazor, is pretty old. So there can be a lot of third-party libraries, components that are out there in the market which Blazor doesn't have. But you can always make one if you need it.
Yeah, and I would say that I'm sure that there's like some edge cases, right? Like some obscure things that are not mainstream use cases that maybe Angular supports and maybe Blazor doesn't yet. And also maybe that's only, like you just mentioned, because Blazor is more immature. But give it a few years and Blazor will probably have solutions for those same edge cases.
That's true. That's true. This makes Blazor more exciting. The adaptation is actually, it has been really good, to be honest, because Blazor is still two years old. I guess it was launched in 2017, and probably the Blazor server went into GA in 2019. So if you look at GA version, then it's just 2 years old.
Yeah.
So we have the last question for the day. It's by Bharat. So have you tried Blazor app on Maui?
I have not played with Maui yet, no. And I know that there's all the the .NET 6 previews are out. I've been reading the blogs, but I actually haven't installed a .NET 6 preview yet. Although the goal would be to have a version of Octane on .NET 6 available in November. So, and I mean, the transition from .NET Core 3.1 to .NET 5 was actually super easy. There was no breaking changes. So I'm hoping that it'll be a similar progression to .NET 6. I don't foresee any challenges there, but I'm excited for .NET 6 because .NET 6, the fact that it's an LTS release, right, for both Blazor Server and Blazor WebAssembly, that'll probably encourage more people to jump on, right? It's people sometimes don't. They feel that there's too much risk around using GA releases, and they want those LTS releases, especially large enterprises. So it'll be nice
True.
to have .NET 6.
That makes sense indeed. Since you have mentioned about the skepticism with people in working around with the current releases that are even though they are in GA. So there was one particular question that I face on normal conferences wherever I go. Where I host a Blazor application, any talk on Blazor. They asked me this one particular question: Can you tell me about any of the applications which are built on top of Blazor and are running live right now? So, are you aware of any? It would be really helpful for me.
And yeah, there definitely are. I don't have a list off that I can provide, but like, yeah, like I mean, I have obviously a number of public sites that are running on Blazor. I guess they're looking for more notable examples, maybe.
More
It's funny.
enterprise grade, maybe.
Yeah, I asked. Actually, I reached out to Dan Roth, right, who's the
Program
program
manager.
manager for Blazor, and I said that this question keeps coming up, and he said that Microsoft is working on it. That because there's the two different types of aspects to that question. Usually, like there's people who are looking for quantity of sites that are running on a particular technology, right? That kind of proves that there's a broad adoption. And then there's other folks that are looking for like deep, detailed case studies, right? Like tell me all the details about all the complexities of it and what were the benefits and like white paper kind of stuff. And so it takes a lot of work to create all of that information and make it available. So, and because I think Blazor's new, there's just not a lot of it available yet. But I think that like having that information available would really help with well, for those of us, right, who have to deal with those questions.
That's true. Even during community conversation, I do stumble upon this question like, are you aware of something like, are any orgs actually using it to build these POCs for some of their prospects? So do you make any of them in your organization, Shaun? Maybe that will give more confidence to the
Yeah.
folks out there.
Oh yeah. We are developing Blazor applications. Absolutely. But in a lot of those cases, they can't be, the details of them can't be shared because they're sometimes they're internal, or there's like
Experimental.
confidentiality reasons, right, where you can't share information about the technologies that certain customers are using. So
That makes sense.
yeah, and yeah.
Okay, there's a lot of confidentiality with this question.
Yeah, but yeah, it is like almost like the number one question that people ask.
True. Enterprise adoption is actually, always a concern because you learn a new technology and you want it to use in your work at least, right? That's why you learn it in the first place. Hobby is there, but still, adaptation always, at an enterprise grade always helps. It keeps you motivated to learn more about this tech.
Yeah.
So hopefully by .NET 6 release, or else the next time we have you on board, we'll have more use cases revolving around this.
Yeah. I think so. The other thing is I even did some searching. Like you can use built with, right, and search for certain technologies, but it's not even there. It's not easy to identify Blazor, I don't think, or maybe they didn't even have an option to identify it. I think that you could look for WebAssembly, but that's only part of the picture, right? That wouldn't reveal any of the Blazor server
Or the
applications
Blazor
that are out there.
WebAssembly one.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that, yeah, I hope that there'll be more public information available soon.
Hopefully, fingers crossed.
Yeah.
So I'd like to give a shout out to Jeremy, our friend Jeremy, who has been answering questions throughout the whole session. And thank you, Jeremy, for helping us a lot throughout the session by answering some of the questions. So it was really helpful. And do mention your email address in the chat window. We have something up for you. It's pretty exciting. And I know that you have been working on Blazor for some time now. You're excited about it, and I have something more exciting for you. So now is the important time to pick up the two winners who are gonna get the book on web development with Blazor by Jeremy, which is sponsored by our sponsor pack. So Shaun, which were the two most interesting questions that you found throughout the Q&A session?
I think that there were a lot of good questions. It's tough to pick. So Prince, was that his name, Prince?
Yep.
He asked quite a few insightful questions. So I think that he's probably deserving of one of the prizes.
We have one more.
I know. Would you? So could you?
You can always go back to the the StreamYard window and check to the scroll through this comment section.
Yeah, I think. How do I get back there? That's my question. Is oh, here we go.
Yeah.
Stop sharing. Okay, and comments.
So Prince, in the meanwhile, you can share your email address at the chat window, and we'll be sharing the ebook with you.
Yeah, I thought so. Leonardo asked quite a lot of good questions as well.
That's great. So we have two winners. One is Prince and the other is Leonardo. So Leonardo, please do mention your email address at the chat window, and we'll send you your copy of Web Development with Blazor, written by Jeremy, who is again a Microsoft MVP. So this is a pretty new book that is sponsored by our sponsor pack. So I hope you find it exciting, and thank you for joining in. So before we close on, we have been going pretty overboard now. Thank you, Shaun, for being patient. And this is one particular question that I would like to ask you. Like Octane is an open source project, right?
Yep.
So what motivates you in building, such open source projects? What was the, how did it all begin? Like, you happened with DNN. So was it the motivation behind creating Octane?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I like building frameworks. I've always enjoyed building frameworks that make software development easier. I used to build them only for myself, and then I guess it was with DNN that I realized that by sharing those frameworks with others, it actually provides a lot of value for not just myself, but a lot of other people. And I went through the whole sort of life cycle with DNN. And then I think when I left DNN Corp in 2014, I didn't think I would probably do another or create another open source project. I was kind of burned out. It's a lot of work. It takes a lot of commitment. But then for whatever reason, in 2018, it was actually, I was thinking that there weren't enough frameworks for .NET Core that were available. And Scott Hunter actually reached out to me and asked if I had taken a look at Blazor. And after I looked at it, I was pretty excited because I think it had a lot of the characteristics that I had been missing in some of the earlier Microsoft tooling. And from there, it just kind of grew into, I think even when I created the initial proof of concept, I wasn't sure that I wanted to release it as an open source project, but then I did, and here we are. So, but yeah, it definitely, I don't know. I have a passion, I guess, for technology. And it's fun to share that technology. I really like the interactions that I get to have online with developers. And I've met like some really great friends over my career by being involved with open source. There's some really great people in the .NET ecosystem, and I feel lucky that I've been able to get to know a lot of them. It's funny, even Jeremy is on the .NET Foundation project committee with me. So, I mean, and then he takes time on a Saturday to come to this event. So, I mean, yeah, it's a great example, right, of just how close the .NET community is. It's great.
That makes sense. That's how Octane started. So if you have a section on Octane anywhere and you wanted to talk about the history of Octane, how it came into, you can say this, what Shaun just mentioned now.
Yeah.
So it seems like Leonardo and Prince have shared their email address, but due to some reason with YouTube chat window policies, we are unable to see that. So I request Leonardo and Prince to send me a message at my LinkedIn profile, and I'll just connect with you and share the e-copies over there. I'm sorry, I'm unable to see your email address, to be honest, and after the stream ends, I won't even have access to any of the things. So just drop me a message over there and I'll connect with you and share the e-copies. And thank you folks for joining in on a weekend, spending your time learning about a new technology. So Blazor is not new, but it's relatively new. So so thanks again. Thanks everyone for joining in, and thank you, Jeremy. And I'll definitely reach out to you. I have something really special for you. And in the meanwhile, Shaun and I could stay back and say bye to all of you. So bye, guys. Stay safe and
Right.
take care.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's end the broadcast.